Have you ever noticed that the world starts to behave strangely the moment you truly begin to change? When you're still predictable, everything feels calm. When you smile at the right time, nod at the right places, bend just enough to please, you are loved. But the moment you start to awaken, the moment you withdraw your compliance, the moment you begin to listen to yourself more than others, that peaceful surface begins to crack. They won't confront you directly. They'll smile, offer kind advice, tell you become too different, too cold, a bit extreme. But what's the truth? Your silent evolution is exposing their stagnation, and no one wants to face their own shadow. Friedrich Nietzsche didn't write for the faint of heart. He didn't comfort. He didn't excuse me. He didn't coddle. He came like a spiritual earthquake, shattering every belief system built upon fear, hypocrisy, and obedience. He wrote for the souls who had reached the breaking point of conformity and longed for something truer, even if it meant pain, loneliness, and being misunderstood. Because here's the truth: if you want to build a mind that cannot be subdued, you must be willing to give up everything that once made you accepted. From relationships rooted in role-playing, to the values you were taught to obey, to the false safety of belonging to the herd, Nietzsche didn't hand you a map. He simply held up a mirror and asked, do you have the courage to shatter this image and step out of it by yourself? 1. The discomfort of the crowd. When you begin to evolve, there's a strange phenomenon that happens whenever a person truly begins to change. Those around them no longer feel comfortable, not because you've done something wrong, not because you've offended anyone, but because of your silent evolution, even before you speak it aloud, starts to reveal the stagnation in others. You begin to think differently. You no longer laugh at the superficial. You start to question the obvious truths you once believed. You pull away from meaningless conversations and replace them with a kind of depth that isn't unsettling to you, but to them. And then you notice the confused glances. You hear harmless jokes that subtly point out how you've changed. You receive well-meaning advice telling you you're too serious, too different. But what's the truth? They're not confused because you've changed. They're confused because you no longer reflect them. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, those who walk away from the crowd will be criticized not because they are wrong, but because their presence forces others to examine themselves. A person who begins to awaken naturally becomes a mirror, and the painful truth is, not everyone wants to look in the mirror. When you stop living by expectations, you trigger those who are still imprisoned by them. The more you grow in awareness, the harder it becomes to fit in with superficiality. But society does not operate on depth. It operates on consensus. And when you break that consensus, through your silence, your clarity, or your refusal to conform, you disturb the stability the crowd has built. That's why transformation often begins in solitude, because your evolution doesn't just confuse others, it unsettles them. They no longer know how to respond to you. They can't manipulate you with old emotions. They can't read you the way they used to, and that makes them afraid. You don't need to persuade them. You don't need to explain. You only need to understand. Their discomfort is confirmation that your growth is real. So if you're still wondering, why'd I feel distant from those I was once close to? Perhaps you're not disconnected. You're just rising to a level of awareness they're not yet ready to meet. 2. Inner strength is a threat to collective mediocrity. In a world where most people learn to blend in to survive, a person with true inner strength is not seen as a role model. They are seen as a threat. Why? Because someone with inner power doesn't flatter. They don't try to be understood. They don't seek approval to exist. And in a society built on consensus and predictability, such a person destabilizes everything. Inner strength is not a performance. It's not in the hardened voice or lofty words. It shows up in the clarity in your eyes, in your calm amidst chaos, in the truthfulness that makes others uneasy, and most of all, in your refusal to compromise with falsehood. And that's why it doesn't just confuse, it intimidates. Nietzsche called this the clash between the strong individual and collective mediocrity. In the genealogy of morals, he exposed how society manufactures a slave morality, where weakness is painted as humility, obedience is virtue, and helplessness is moral strength. In such a world, the strong are no longer admired. They're labeled as arrogant, cold, and unfeeling. Why? because they expose the smallness the crowd has tried so hard to hide. A free individual, living by their own values, becomes an unwilling mirror reflecting others' unspoken fears. They don't follow the script. They don't need empty advice. They don't react the way people expect. And this forces the crowd to ask, if they can do that, why can't I? That's when mediocrity fights back, not with violence, but with subtler weapons, polite mockery, cold stares, quiet social exclusion, the seed of doubt. Maybe I'm the one who's wrong, but you're not wrong. You're simply stepping outside a system designed to make everyone the same. Inner strength is not power over others. It is the ability not to be controlled by them. And in a world built on politeness, predictability, and pleasing, that alone disrupts the system. You don't need to prove anything. Your very existence, if rooted in real, is already speaking volumes. Free, Nietzsche and the brutal truth. Suffering is a tool of transformation. Most of us grow up believing that suffering is wrong, something to avoid, something to escape from as quickly as possible. Society paints happiness as the ultimate state, and pain as a failure, a fall from grace. But Friedrich Nietzsche, with a gaze sharp as a blade, shattered that illusion. To him, suffering is not a glitch in the system of life. Suffering is the system. It is the forge where the mind is sharpened, the will is tested, the ego stripped bare. He once wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." This isn't poetry, it's a psychological diagnosis. It is the truth most people refuse to face. No deep transformation ever happens in comfort. Be honest with yourself. Weren't your most profound changes born from your lowest points? Didn't courage grow only after heartbreak forced you to stand back up? No one grows from being coddled. We grow from being broken. Nietzsche did not romanticize pain. He did not worship suffering as some noble martyrdom. He simply pointed out a truth. If you can face suffering, not escape it, not deny it, it becomes the raw material of your rebirth. And this is what the system doesn't want you to realize. Because if you become strong enough to walk through your pain, without needing to be comforted by entertainment, consumption, religion, or feel-good philosophies, you can no longer be manipulated. You no longer fall for promises to make you feel better. Instead, you begin to ask, I don't need to feel better, I need to feel true. Nietzsche stared into the abyss and walked into it, and what he found wasn't destruction, but a force waiting to be unleashed. You don't need to run from suffering. You only need to change your relationship with it. It's not your enemy, it's your teacher, not a punishment, a doorway, not an obstacle, but the threshold to an inner depth that peace has never touched. The brutal truth is this: the moment you suffer and do not break, you begin to become something that cannot be broken. 4. The death of God and the birth of the will to create meaning. When Friedrich Nietzsche declared, "God is dead," he wasn't mocking religion, nor launching a meaningless rebellion. He was exposing a terrifying, yet necessary, truth. Modern humanity has lost its final spiritual anchor, and now must carry the unbearable weight of existence, without a heaven to look up to for salvation. Nietzsche didn't kill God, he killed illusion, the illusion that someone above is orchestrating your life, the illusion that your suffering is part of some greater plan, the illusion that if you just believe and wait, life will eventually take you where you need to go. So when that illusion crumbles, what are you left with? You, alone, facing a silent universe. No plan, no pre-written meaning, no divine hand to steer you. Only you, and the terrifying power to create your own meaning. It sounds like freedom, but for most, it is pure existential dread. Because now, there's no one left to blame. No more excuses, no inherited moral structure to hide behind. And that's when real life begins. Out of this desert, the will emerges. Nietzsche called it der Wille zur Macht, the will to power. Not the power to control others, but the power to overcome oneself, to rebuild a value system from the ashes, to decide what matters, not based on tradition, not based on the masses, but on radical honesty with your own being. When God dies, you are no longer watched, you are no longer judged from above, but you are also no longer protected. You are the one who writes the rules, and the one who bears the consequences. You are free, but you must be strong enough to withstand that freedom. Nietzsche didn't glorify atheism, he glorified spiritual maturity. the kind that only begins when you stop demanding the universe to make sense and start creating meaning with every step you take. When there is no longer a God above, the sky is no longer the limit. You, and only you, must decide whether this life is worth living. 5. The Übermensch, a model of the unbreakable individual. When Nietzsche killed God, he didn't leave behind a meaningless void. He opened up space for a new kind of being to emerge. A being who no longer lives by outdated moral codes, who no longer seeks redemption, who no longer needs approval from the crowd, a being who has transcended themselves. Nietzsche called this being the Übermensch, the Overman. Make no mistake, the Übermensch is not a superhero, not a proud, larger-than-life figure walking among mortals. It is a philosophical symbol, a human who has broken free from all the invisible chains that bind the will. In Nietzsche's world, modern humans live like sheep, obedient, fearful, following a morality designed to keep them tame, a morality that teaches you to sacrifice yourself, restrain your ambition, fear being wrong, live for others, and calls that goodness. The Übermensch steps beyond that morality, not out of selfishness, but because he refuses to live a life written by someone else. The Übermensch does not ask permission to exist. They don't ask, what will people think? They don't obey rules to earn praise. They ask themselves, is this worthy of me? Who am I living for? Am I simply repeating someone else's life? The Übermensch doesn't seek to fit in. They create truth. They don't adapt to the world. They impose meaning upon it. That's why Nietzsche called them value creators. In a world that rewards conformity, those who dare to define morality, success, and even the self on their own terms, are seen as a threat, and at the same time, as the next step in evolution. But becoming the Übermensch is no easy path. You will be alone, you will be misunderstood, you will be called arrogant, cold, and unreachable, because your refusal to compromise is something society hasn't learned how to handle yet. But if you are brave enough to endure that isolation, to rebuild your value system from the ashes, to live without waiting for anyone to hand you your identity, then you have entered the territory Nietzsche reserved for those who dare to live truly. The domain of the Übermensch. 6. You will be alone, but that solitude is a privilege. Awakening, once it begins, doesn't bring celebration, it brings isolation, not because you want to leave people behind, but because the old world doesn't know what to do. With a newly awakened person, you step outside the templates. You begin to ask questions instead of repeating answers. You quietly exit shallow conversations, and relationships build on emotional dependency. And then, you realize, you're standing alone, no applause, no encouragement, only you, and a silence you've never heard before. Friedrich Nietzsche never hid this reality. He didn't promise that becoming the Übermensch would lead to instant happiness. On the contrary, he wrote, "He who wants to give light must endure burning." And the first burning is solitude. Most people live in an invisible herd, where every thought, every belief, every action is shaped by the reactions and expectations of others. When you leave that herd, you don't just lose the comfort of belonging, you lose the version of yourself that only existed through their approval. That's why so many go back. They can't stand the silence. They can't bear not being understood or mirrored. They start to ask, maybe I was wrong, but you are not wrong. You are simply ahead. Nietzsche once said, no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. And the first price is losing the people who kept you in your comfort zone. This loneliness is not absence. It is empty ground, a space where you can rebuild the self, a place with no noise, no unspoken expectations, no roles to perform. It is the first place where you finally hear your own voice, raw, unfiltered, uncorrupted. Don't fear the silence, because in it, you will meet yourself again. And remember, once you truly become unbreakable, you will not be alone forever. You are simply creating the space for those on the same frequency, those who are also awakening, to find you. 7. Collective mediocrity does not forgive the different. In a world where most people live by inertia, obediently following rules labeled normal, true difference, especially inner difference, is always perceived as a threat. You don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to argue, rebel, or prove anything. Just the simple act of not living by the script, of being out of sync with the programmed rhythms of society, is enough to make you a foreign object, a loose cog disrupting the familiar machinery. Friedrich Nietzsche called this the system of slave morality, a value structure built by those who never dared to grow beyond their own smallness. In this morality, strength is labeled arrogance, ambition is called selfishness, personal freedom is condemned as apathy, and anyone who dares to step out of mediocrity is met with labels, isolation, and critique. Because the crowd doesn't hate you, they hate the fact that you are living proof that they could have lived differently but didn't. Your difference doesn't just make them uncomfortable, it forces them to face their own stagnation. In response, they often unconsciously attack, not with violence, but with sarcasm, doubt, and guilt. They'll say you're cold, they'll say you're distant, difficult, aloof, but in truth, you've just pulled back the curtain and let awareness in. Collective mediocrity cannot forgive the one who no longer needs its approval, because if you can live well without fitting in, if you can move forward without applause, you've just broken the unspoken rule of the masses. Be like us or disappear. Here's what you must remember. The resistance you face is not proof that you're wrong, it's confirmation that you're rare. Nietzsche didn't fear tyrants, he feared obedient masses, living by a morality designed to protect comfort, spiritual laziness, and unthinking repetition. You don't need to fight them. You just need to refuse to become them. 8. Become dangerous, in the way Nietzsche meant it. Dangerous is a word that makes most people uneasy. It evokes violence, rebellion, something uncontrollable. But in Nietzsche's philosophy, a dangerous person is not a destroyer. They are the ones who cannot be tamed. A dangerous person is someone who makes the old world feel unsafe. Simply by being real, they don't need to scream, break things, or make noise. They disrupt the system by no longer needing it to survive. They walk a different path, in silence, and their mere existence unsettles those who only know how to live by belonging. A dangerous person, according to Nietzsche, is one who has reclaimed the right to define themselves. They are no longer guided by herd morality, by social expectations, by the shoulds and musts etched into collective consciousness. Instead, they follow an inner compass, driven by their own will, their own values, and the courage to pay the price for it. And that is precisely what makes them dangerous, because such a person cannot be controlled. No one can manipulate them with praise or criticism. No one can silence them with exclusion. No one can make them submit by threatening abandonment. That's why, in every era, dangerous people are misunderstood. Socrates was poisoned, Giordano Bruno was burned alive, Nietzsche was called mad, but they all had one thing in common: they refused to bow. And so will you, if you truly want to be free. You must learn how to become dangerous in the highest sense. You must become someone who doesn't need to be liked to feel worthy, doesn't need to be understood to keep walking, doesn't need to be forgiven to live in truth. Nietzsche didn't invite you to become a mindless rebel. He invited you to become so fully yourself that society is forced to re-examine itself. Someone whose presence shakes the foundations of tired definitions. Someone who makes others stop talking and start thinking. You can be that person if you're brave enough to drop the act, if you're honest enough to hear your own true voice, and if you're relentless enough to keep walking, even when no one walks with you. If you've reached the end of this journey, you are no longer who you once were. You no longer wait for someone's nod before making your choices. You no longer live to fit into the mold of any ideology. You no longer seek salvation from the outside, because you've come to understand, no one is coming to save you. There is only you, and the will that decides you are worthy of something greater. Nietzsche didn't write a method for living. He didn't lead you to paradise. He simply stripped away every illusion and left you standing naked in the desert, the only place where you might truly meet yourself again. And in that desert, you begin to see clearly that loneliness is not a punishment, but a birthplace. That difference is not a burden, but a weapon. That strength is not about feeling no pain, but about walking forward even when the pain feels unbearable. The world doesn't need more agreeable people. It needs those who dare to be misunderstood in order to be real. It needs minds that make entire systems feel uneasy, because their presence proves humans can be free without needing permission. And if you are one of them, then you have stepped out of the herd. You have escaped the cage, decorated with compliments, reputation, and approval. You have become dangerous, And for that very reason, you have begun to be free.